So I'm joined today with Professor Karen Berman. Thank you very much for joining us for this oral history.
My pleasure.
And so I'd like to get started by asking about your involvement with neuroimaging. How did that come about?
Well, could I start with sort of my beginnings a little bit?
Perfect. Yeah.
Is that okay? So when I was in high school, and it was a long, long time ago, I was one of very few women who was in advanced math and science classes, and I didn't mind that. Yeah. I sort of actually liked it, and I had some notion that I would be a famous physicist or mathematician, and then I went to college and got caught by biology, and people said, well, you're a girl, you can't go to medical school. So that's what I decided I was going to do, and I did, and it was a time when there really were very few women. I think there were 10% women in my medical school class, and I'd always been fascinated by the brain and what things can go awry in the brain. And so I decided to go into psychiatry, but I also am double boarded, not only in psychiatry, but also nuclear medicine. And at the time I came up, this will sort of tell you how old I am, we really didn't have MRI available. So things like PET and having people breathe xenon-133 gas and watch its appearance and disappearance from various parts of the brain was the only way to study the living, working human brain, and that was my passion. So that's how I got into all of this. And it's been just a privilege and a pleasure to see this field emerge. And before OHBM, there were various smaller, less expert meetings about these topics. And once OHBM came into being, and I was at the very first 1995 meeting in Paris, really? Yeah. It was just extraordinarily exciting, and I think bringing all of us together in a critical mass was really advanced the field in our understanding of the brain, and in my case, how we might be able to use that information to help patients.
Yeah. And how have you seen OHBM change over the years?
Well, it was a little bit of a cottage industry to start with. You've probably heard from other interviewees how at the beginning there was a big battle as to whether we should be an organization or a society and what that meant and how formal or not formal this should be. Over the years, it's just taken off, and a lot of that has to do with technology. And I can remember when I first started out, we had these giant rows of computers that we'd put our data into, and gigantic floppy disks that we used. And it was really laborious to analyze data, and I think that has been an important adjunct to how we've been able to advance the field. The other thing that I think has been extraordinarily important, and I see that a lot in this meeting in particular, is bringing in other parts of neuroscience and brain science in particular. And we spoke a little bit about translational. What does the word translational mean? And I'm seeing it a lot at this meeting. There's more, this afternoon we're going to a transcriptomics session. I don't recall seeing things like that before, but that's what we really need to understand how the brain works and how it goes awry. We need to bring in information at all levels: genetics, cellular, circuits, systems, and behavior.
Bridging those scales is certainly, it's something that there has been more of over the years, but there's certainly room for that to increase as well, and to get this, full understanding of how the brain works.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned also, when we were talking about translational, about your work moving from research into the clinic. Can you tell us a little bit about your successes with that, and how you think that's kind of improving over the years?
So I work at the National Institutes of Health in the United States, which is in the intramural research program, and it's a really very special place where we're encouraged to take risks and do work that perhaps would not be doable in other places. And I think that really stimulated me. I've been there for many years, and it makes it a little bit special. So when I was a young physician and taking care of patients, I was particularly struck by my patients with schizophrenia and how little I could do to help them. And I remember one particular young man, he was just 18 and had become psychotic, and he was very frightened, and I realized that his prognosis was poor and that I really couldn't do very much to help him. And that's what has spurred me all these years to study the brain and try to understand how it works in health and in disease. And I'm absolutely certain that after these decades of work, much of it spurred by neuroimaging and being able to integrate neuroimaging with other disciplines of neuroscience, that we are in a better place to help people. We still don't have diagnostic techniques for the kinds of things that I study, but there are new medications. There are things like non-invasive brain stimulation techniques that are very much guided by neuroimaging, and you know, I think that's been a very important course for this organization.
Yeah. And so more broadly, then, what do you see happening with neuroimaging in the US these days?
What do I see happening in the U.S. specifically?
Yeah. I mean, this has come up that it's difficult to be so kind of regionally specific, isn't it? So maybe with like
particularly at this meeting. Yeah. One of my very favorite things about this meeting is how international and how diverse it is, and how it brings many different approaches together.
Yeah.
So I'm asking a little more about your question.
Yeah. So maybe we should purposefully think more about how different techniques can be learnt by others. But so more than with psychiatric neuroimaging, how do you see that kind of developing now and over the coming years?
What new technologies? Is that sort of the question?
So I guess it could be about how understanding changes in connectomics might influence the understanding of these conditions like schizophrenia or perhaps how this transcriptional science is kind of feeding into that as well.
Well, I'm not sure this is exactly an answer to your question, but I think one of the things I've seen at this meeting, which I really appreciate, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is ongoing efforts to really understand what the signals that we measure mean. Resting state connectivity, what is it exactly? What perturbs it? What are the variables? How do we analyze it? And I've seen a lot of very incisive work at this meeting attempting to understand that, and I think that's key. And this is a little bit of my own bias from my background, that I came from really gold standard ways of measuring things like regional cerebral blood flow, metabolism with fluorodeoxyglucose, things like that. And MR techniques are much more flexible and can be tailored in really special ways. But we still are struggling to understand the signals in many ways. So I think that's still an important area of work for us here in this field.
Great.
Sorry, one more. And to be able to integrate it with things like PET, or other ways of measuring neurochemistry, MR spectroscopy.
Yes. Yeah. And certainly, like, I think that's one thing that I've seen over the last few years, is that there is more kind of representation of PET imaging. There was talks today on simultaneous PET MR and what we can get from that. And I think that's really exciting.
Right.
Definitely.
Right.
And so going back to OHBM then, so what memories really stand out for you from your attendances at OHBM?
Well, I certainly remember the first meeting in 1995 in Paris, and how exciting it was. I was a sweet young thing. I don't know about sweet, but I was young. And being there together with all of these people whose work I'd read about and who inspired me was really life-changing. And also coming together with a critical mass of people with the same interests and really smart, creative, fun people.
Yeah. That's
Okay, so early on, when I came to the NIH, and brain imaging was really in its infancy, functional brain imaging in particular, we used a technique that had been originated in Scandinavia by some famous people, having people breathe xenon-133 gas, measuring with sodium iodide scintillation detectors all over the head, how quickly it arrived and departed from the brain, and we could show that things like cognition changed that. And being able at the NIH to not only get and use that technique, but also to study patients with schizophrenia when they were off their medications is something that I'm most proud of. And my colleagues and I did one of the very first studies that demonstrated frontal lobe functional abnormalities in schizophrenia, and that's been the foundation of a considerable amount of work. And using PET, we were able to show that those functional abnormalities were related to subcortical dopamine abnormalities, and that these were linked systems that were very much gone awry in schizophrenia.
Yeah, fantastic. And so perhaps one last question then, which we'll try and fit in. So you were involved in the creation of OHBM. Can you remember the atmosphere then and what that was like?
I remember it being tremendously exciting from my viewpoint. I remember a lot of very, what's a good word for this, very opinionated people speaking and having viewpoints about where the organization should and shouldn't go. For me, those were exciting conversations. They got to be contentious sometimes, but that's the way science is. And that's the way science proceeds. There's discussion, there's give and take, different opinions that finally distill out to some very good common path.
And there was an agreement at the end of it, which is good to hear.
I'm not sure there was always agreement, but there was enough of a consensus to proceed.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Berman.
My pleasure.
Cheers.